So, you guys remember when I said a couple episodes back that, we should be appreciating the fact that the show was pacing itself because of what would eventually happen? Yeah, this is exactly the kind of stuff that I was talking about.
Don't change the channel, don't touch that dial. We got it all on UHF. Kick off your sneakers.
Hey guys, it's Counting in my review for Mr. Robot, Season 4, Episode 7, Proxy Authentication Required, and holy shit, what an episode this really was. And look, this was an episode that I assumed was going to be crazy. I definitely assumed was going to be an intense one, but oh my god, I was not prepared for what this ended up being. This might just be the best episode, not just of this season, but we've ever had of Mr. Robot. And I'm serious about that. I mean, this was so much more deeper, so much more complex, and just so much more impressive than anything I could have ever imagined. And really fixed basically any problems I had with this season. There was one glaring flaw with this season, and that was everything going on with Vera, which we'll get into, but this episode was absolutely insane. It was an absolute game changer, and everything that everyone said, this episode is very much deserving of. This is one of the best episodes of TV that I have seen in years, honestly. This just felt so different, and it felt so authentic in that way, and I just really can't applaud Sam Esmail enough for going where he did with this episode, but we're just getting to right now. So, where to begin, honestly? I mean, with an episode like this that is so dynamic and has so many key events, it's very hard to figure out where to really go with this one, but I think we'll just get right into it. Yeah, so there was definitely a big reveal, which, I'm definitely going to talk about for sure, but let's talk about the one thing that I was very worried with this episode, and that was Vera. Going into this, like I said, I have really loved this season. I think this has definitely felt the most vital. The momentum has just not been stopping since Angela's death. And it's one of those seasons where it certainly does feel final. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, this doesn't feel like a final season. I would very much disagree. I feel like they couldn't make this feel more definitive in that way. And the one flaw that I did have, though, with all that said, was the inclusion of Vera. I just didn't really see the point of him. He felt like something that was secondary to me, and he just felt like he was going to be an obstacle that got in Elliot's way. And then we have this episode, and basically that was the entire point. And now that I see where they were going with it, I really can't see a version of the season that didn't have Vera, because Vera, yes, definitely he's someone that is very evil. He's very cunning in that way. Yes, he can be very annoying, but the whole point of his character is that he was the one that was opening up Elliot. He got Elliot to finally uncover his darkest secrets in that way, and he finally got him to, finally stop hiding and finally reveal his true self, warts and all. And that's something that we didn't realize with Elliot. We didn't realize just how much Elliot was keeping from us. We didn't realize just how closed off Elliot was. We knew there was definitely a lot of stuff that he had forgotten, but I don't think any of us anticipated what it was going to be. And so, as a result, I have to say, I really enjoyed Vera's inclusion in this episode. I think they did a really good job of showing what he really wanted to do. I mean, yeah, he started off with the crazy monologues and things like that, but this show very much painted him as a complete lunatic in that way. I mean, this guy is such a psychopath. He is very evil. He's very radical in that way, and that's something this episode did really well. It showed that, you're not supposed to feel, you are supposed to feel threatened and intimidated by this guy, but you're also not really supposed to take him all that seriously, because he very much is, someone that believes that he is doing the right thing. He believes that, him creating this empire with Elliot and all that stuff, he feels this is his doing, and especially seeing what they ended up doing with him towards the end, which I'll get into, I just really thought that Vera felt far more three-dimensional than I really was expecting him to. I mean, he really does feel like someone that got Elliot to open up in that way. And yes, like I said, he was very threatening, but I think they did a really good job with him here for sure. And again, I really can't see another version of this episode where he isn't in it. But of course, we have to talk about this reveal because this is going to be the big thing that everyone is, of course, discussing. So yeah, we have this scene with Elliot and Krista where Vera is really pressing her hard into uncovering something about Ellie because she said in the last episode that Mr. Robot would be the thing that breaks him because that's what Vera's essential plan was, and we didn't really know what she was talking about. It turns out that not only has Mr. Robot been with Elliot the entire time, but he is a mask of what Elliot wanted his father to be. Because in reality, Edward Alderson was not the good-natured, nice father that we've come to know throughout this entire show. He was actually sexually abusing Elliot, and this was something that Elliot has kept repressed throughout all of his life, and yeah, this is definitely a very hard pill to swallow for sure. It's definitely a really huge shift, but I went through a bunch of old scenes of like Edward and Elliot talking together, and all the clues really were there in that way. I mean, there are scenes where things like Edward saying to Elliot, like, don't tell your mother, and like, this is our little secret. Like, these were red herrings all along. We just didn't see it as that because, again, Elliot is someone who, similar to how he is a hacker, he likes to hack the audience at points. He wanted us to believe that this was who his father was, that his father was incapable of something this dastardly. Hell, last season they basically made us think that like Elliot's father was just a really good father to him and that he was misunderstood in that way, only to pull the rug out and show that that's exactly what Elliot wanted us to think. He's been keeping this out, he has been keeping this from us for so long. He has been repressing this for so long, and it really does make a lot of sense, though. I mean, look at the first episode of this entire show. The first scene of this show is Elliot's, busting, basically taking down this pedophile and bringing him to justice, and Elliot has zero remorse over it. Even this season, the whole episode where that one guy, I can't remember his name, but he ended up committing suicide, Elliot felt zero remorse. It's not because of the fact that Elliot is heartless, it's because this is clearly him getting justice for what his father did to him, and considering that this entire show has been about him getting justice for Edward's death, it completely recontextualizes everything here. This has never been a story about getting justice and taking down these corporations that ruin his family. No, it's about a very repressed, very damaged individual that has completely lost sight of his actual goal and is sidetracked and is basically distracting himself from his true, anguish and that true hatred that he has. And oh my god, I mean, look, I've always talked about how good Rami Malek is in this show, but I don't think he's ever been better than that scene when he is just breaking down and just finally just letting loose in that way. And finally just, finally just not acting like a robot, because Elliot is someone who is very emotionally repressed. He doesn't like to admit all of that. And he's someone who likes to keep his emotions in check. I mean, even in the beginning of this episode, he's very calculated in him wanting to protect Krista. He's very calm in that way. We rarely ever see Elliot breaking down like this. There's only been a few occasions. The only other time I can, I can remember him like breaking down is when Trenton and Mobley died and he was blaming himself for it. But it's never been to this extent where he is just completely unstable and he is like, at a loss for words. He's screaming, he's crying. I mean, he is not holding back at this point. He's finally letting out those emotions. And in a way, as much as we despise Vera for it, it's great that Vera was able to break him down in this way, because this is the thing that is finally getting Elliot to come to to come to reality in that way. He's not hiding anything anymore. And I love the way they set this up, though, because again, you knew that was what Krista was going to say. You knew definitely Krista had some really disturbing news to tell Elliot, but the way that whole scene was framed, with him in denial and him basically not knowing what she was saying until she, explicitly told him what was going on, you can just finally see just how big of a shift this was for him. He went from someone who was in denial to someone who is now fully coming to terms with it, and It's very tragic in that way, but it also really changes the role of Mr. Robot because, like I said, Mr. Robot is not someone that, has always been someone that has felt a little bit deceitful, but now his entire role is different. This season was the first season we trusted him, but that's because we were seeing a lot of the show through his eyes and not Elliot's. And I think that's why it was such a wise choice to have Mr. Robot as a narrator for this first half of the season because we were fully on board with what he was saying. We trusted his every word. So to see this side of him where basically he's been keeping this from Elliot this entire time because he wanted to protect him, it's heartbreaking to watch. And obviously, we know that Mr. Robot is a split personality of Elliot, but now it makes sense why Mr. Robot existed. Mr. Robot existed because this was Elliot's way of basically protecting himself from his actual past and not admitting what actually went down and trying to keep that good image of his father. Mr. Robot is kind of what Elliot, I think, wanted Edward to be, but alas, that was not the case. And again, just moments like that just really upped this entire episode. I mean, this was already a very intense episode, but that reveal literally changes everything. And I don't think it's one of those things where this was shock value or this just felt like, Sam Esmail wanted to do a twist. No, I really do think this is something he has had planned for since the show has begun. I really do think it's been that long, and I think the way this was handled was just masterfully done. And like I said, going back, it really does make a lot of sense. It was something that I know people predicted. I personally never thought it was going in that direction. I never really saw them doing something like that. But now that we know where this actually was headed, and now that we know what Elliot's been through, a lot of his actions just make a lot more sense in that way. And it's a show that is begging me to rewatch it. Like, after the season ends, I'm definitely going to go back and, rewatch a bunch of episodes just because of what this reveal really does mean. And even for Vera, again, as villainous and as monstrous of an individual as he is, I think the moment where he's talking to Elliot and he's talking about how, he had to go from all of his mom's clients and things like that, I think that is genuine. I think he genuinely was trying to comfort Elliot in that way. And I do think that he was serious in that moment, which makes it all the more heartbreaking that that is the moment where Krista does end up killing Vera. And again, even though it's a sign of relief, it's also kind of heartbreaking knowing what Vera went through. These were two people who were very damaged by abusive, they were abusive upbringings, and it brought out the worst in them. For Vera, it's turned him into a criminal, and for Elliot, it's turned him into someone who has this dissociative, personality disorder in that way, and someone who just has a very hard time expressing his feelings. But again, everything really does check here, from, like I said, that first episode with him busting that pedophile, to even smaller moments with him not wanting to even hug his sister. Now it makes sense. Now it makes sense why he is so disassociative, why he has that terrible social anxiety in that way. It's not just because of a mental disorder. It's because of the trauma that his father inflicted on him. It's incredibly fucked up for sure. And yes, it is definitely something that is very hard to think about, but again, I think the show did such an excellent job of getting us to this reveal and really does elevate the entire show for me in such a brilliant way. And I can't believe this turned out as well as it did. It really, to me, I think is the best reveal the show has done since probably the reveal that Mr. Robot and Elliot were the same person. It might even be stronger than that, to be honest with you, because it really does rapidly change the entire show moving forward. And I'm going to talk more about where it's going to go, obviously. I have more to say about this episode than that, but just such a brilliant reveal all around. And it's so big, in fact, that even actors from the show weren't given access to this script. BD1 literally said in an interview that, if their character wasn't in this episode, they did not get to see this script. Sam Esmail was trying to keep this as under wraps as possible. And considering, today with, the internet and Reddit and things like that and the general zeitgeist of all that stuff, it's very hard to keep that so secretive. And I can't believe that he actually pulled this off as well as he did. And I think that alone is commendable. but it's also because of just how well set up everything was. I mean, for the first like 20 minutes or so, this was a very simple hostage situation. You had Elliot and him doing whatever he can to protect Krista. That was his main objective. But then you also had Mr. Robot, who just kept telling him, like, we got to get out of here. We have to leave, doing whatever he can to try to get Elliot's, to exit, and in that way. And then you had Vera and him trying to break down Elliot, and then Krista doing whatever she can to try to make sure that Elliot was safe, but also just to make sure that Vera was dealt with in that way. So again, it turned very simple, but I think that was really their way of setting up everything and us not even realizing it. And especially Mr. Robot trying to get Elliot out of there. I think he knew. I think Mr. Robot knew that this was going to come out. I think he knew that there was something that was going to be revealed that Elliot didn't know about. And also, as far as Mr. Robot goes, a lot of people have questioned, do I think he's going to be in the rest of the show? And I honestly don't. I don't think that Mr. Robot is going to be here anymore. I think when he says to Elliot, I can no longer protect you, I kind of feel like that might be it. And I know it sucks because Christian Slater is so good in this show. And we might see him more in like flashbacks and things like that, because I'm assuming that Elliot's going to have to recall some very haunting memories after this whole thing. But I really do think this might be the end of Mr. Robot, because Elliot, honestly, he doesn't need him now. There's nothing else to protect him from. Everything that he has kept hidden, he's now having to re-explore in that way. And I think this is going to be the thing that gets Elliot to start talking to us again. I really do think that's the case. But like I was trying to say, I think all of those scenes of, Elliot trying to protect Krista and Mr. Robot trying to get Elliot out of there just really set up how complex things were going to get. It started off very simple to kind of mislead us into thinking it was going to be a very straightforward episode, but then to completely turn it on its head and turn into maybe the most impactful episode of this entire show. But the other thing I love about this episode is just how truly complex all of this was. I mean, yes, obviously in a surface level, this was an episode about Elliot finally coming to terms with his past and no longer trying to hide from it anymore. But I also read something about how some people think this episode is kind of a meditation on the 5 stages of grief in that way, which makes sense because Elliot's been through a tremendous amount. I mean, when you really think about what Elliot's been through in this past year, it's insane. He started off with the death of Shayla, and then eventually all of his, crew died of F Society. All of them are dead. Angela's dead. Terrell's dead. His mother's dead. I mean, everyone that matters to him, minus Darlene, and Krista is dead at this point. And a lot of this episode being in 5 acts, which of course I'm going to get into, a lot of that really does represent the 5 stages of grief in that way, whether it's the denial with Elliot just being in denial about the whole situation, not really knowing what this was really all about, and then of course stage 2 with anger when Mr. Robot is really going on Vera and him, just basically making a mockery out of him and telling him just how crazy he really was, but also just how psychotic he was in that way. And then stage 3 where Vera gets Elliot to bargain for Krista's life, which is such a powerful scene in the way. And one of the many scenes, like I said, that really did explore just how great of an actor Rami Malek really is when he's given something great to deal with. Stage 4 with depression, obviously, with the twist, and then stage 5 with acceptance, which is when, Vera is finally helping him accept what happened. So that's another way to look at it. And again, this is not something that I originally came up with. I actually read a comment about it, but I do think that is definitely a way to look at this episode, because Elliot's been through a healthy amount of grief throughout this entire season, but he hasn't really had that time to deal with it. And in a way, this is kind of him grieving over everything that he's been through, and him kind of grappling with all that. I mean, this is the man that killed Shayla. Well, he didn't kill Shayla. His brother, of course, killed Shayla, but he was responsible for Shayla's death. And in a way, Krista killing Vera is justice for Shayla, finally. And I do think that moving forward, we're going to see him finally deal with that. We're going to see him finally react to these things that he's had zero reaction to whatsoever. And I think that's another way to look at this episode for sure. So again, I think I've covered enough over everything that happened in this episode. Let's talk about the technical stuff, because holy shit, where we begin. Look, if it was up to me, and I know you guys, this is going to be a very unpopular opinion, but if it was up to me, Sam Esmail would write and direct every single episode of this show, because he just goes all out. Whenever he is writing and directing, you have the most creative shit, you have the weirdest ideas, but they work so well with the show. The way this episode is directed, it's so thrilling in that way, but it also feels so theatrical, and not just because the entire episode is filmed like a play, it's also because, as Elliot's saying throughout the entire episode, Vera wants a show. We got to give him a show. So that's what he gets. Vera does get a show in that way because of the directing. Everything feels so much more heightened, but not to the sense where it feels too much like a play. Everything just really feels like it's on the line. It really feels like Esmail wanted this to be his magnum opus of the show, and it very much is in that way. I mean, this is their Ozymandias. This is their international assassin. You know, this is their episode of The Sopranos that everyone loves that I can't think of right now, but you guys know which one I'm talking about. Like, this is that episode, and it really is due to Esmail's directing, but also his writing here was just so brilliant. And the choice to have the entire episode be all in 5 acts structurally was a brilliant choice for sure, which we'll get into. But also the choice to have the entire episode just be this story, I think was a really smart idea, because you really are feeling every second of that tension, every second of Vera pressing harder on Elliot, or even when we cut to Krista and her being, you know, tied up in things like that, or us really seeing Elliot go through this and how much it's really just making him go through the ringer, or Mr. Robot and his reluctance to admit to Elliot what's actually going on, and him finally accepting the fact that he has to be away from Elliot and he can't protect him anymore. You really just felt every single second of it, and there was so much going on. There just wasn't time to cut back to Darlene and all that stuff, and I feel like it was a really smart decision to focus the entire episode just on this situation. It really felt like this is everything the show has been leading up to, and we really had no idea that that was going to be the case. We really had no idea that this was going to be the turning point of the entire show. If you had told me that the turning point in the show would be would have to do with Vera, I would have laughed in your face. And I mean, I'm happy about this because, like I said, I wanted to believe that Vera had a larger purpose, and I'm glad to see in reality that he really was the key in that way. And it really is just due to Esmail's brilliant writing throughout this entire episode. I also love that we didn't see any flashbacks. I think it makes sense that we didn't actually see what happened, because Elliot himself doesn't want to face those painful memories, and us not seeing it, it just makes it all the more horrifying to picture what Elliot went through. You know, the scene of him having to lock Darlene in a closet and him getting a baseball bat to, you know, to defend himself because he knew what his father was capable of, and then thinking, oh my god, just thinking that maybe he could have done something to Darlene as well. I mean, it's just... it's horrifying to think about, and I think the fact that we didn't have flashbacks made it that much more horrifying, and I love the way the writing was done here. But the cinematography was just out of this world in this episode, from the difference in aspect ratio, which is always welcome for sure, to basically the entire episode being set like a stage play. It was just so many great choices all around. The way the camera moved was different. The way that certain scenes were positioned was different. This was a completely different episode of Mr. Robot on a cinematography level entirely. And look, Mr. Robot always stands out when it comes to its cinematography, but never to this extent. I don't think it's ever stuck out the way it has here, and it was just so impressive how much they kept up with that aesthetic. They could have broken it at any time they wanted to, and the fact that they didn't, I thought was so impressive. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I kept waiting for them to go back to the traditional format, and the fact that they didn't, I just really adored in that way. And again, I haven't seen this ambitious of an hour of television pretty much since Leftovers, honestly. That's the last time I've been this impressed by an episode of television. One where I'm like, that's one of the greatest episodes of TV I've ever seen. I mean, yeah, shows like BoJack Horseman and things like that, they impress me with stuff like this all the time, but this was just on another level for me, especially cinematography-wise, but also Matt Quayle's score. I know I've been gushing about it a lot lately, and I'm gonna sound very redundant, but it truly has never stood out in the way it did here. It was so... What I love about it is that this was the traditional Matt Quayle, but he stripped away all the technological stuff and made it so much more theatrical, made it so much more bombastic, made it feel like everything was on the line, and every single time that score came in, it just heightened the tension every single scene. It's the kind of score that could make things feel laughable, could make things feel distracting, but somehow it just worked perfectly, and I loved every single second of the score here. I think Matt Quayle absolutely outdid himself. He's always outdoing himself, and it's always a standout, but again, never to the extent that it's been in this episode. Especially the moment where, well, the two moments that stuck out the most for me, I would say, is when Elliot was, basically admitting that he needed Krista, and then, of course, the moment where Elliot realizes, what actually happened. If you listen very carefully, you'll hear the classic Mr. Robot theme from Season 1, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You'll hear that, but it's a more slower, toned down, theatrical version of that, and it's just amazing. I loved everything going on instrumentation wise, and it's the best it's ever sounded. And the editing, like I said, the choice to have this entire episode be in 5 acts, but also to have it be unedited, was brilliant. So much so to the point where I did not want to watch this episode with commercials. If you go on the USA app, unfortunately you have to watch this with commercials, and their infinite wisdom, they decided to do that. And I honestly have no idea why, because I do not think this episode works unless you watch it without commercials. If you watch this episode with commercials, I just don't think it's as effective. I don't think this episode works as well, with interruptions. It works because there aren't interruptions, so you feel like you're trapped. You feel claustrophobic. You feel every single second of what's going on with Elliot and what he has to go through at that time, what's processing through his head. You feel every single second of it, and the choice to have it in 5 acts, I think, was just absolutely brilliant in that way, and I just can't praise it enough technologically. Overall, this was just a game-changing episode in every sense of the word. Look, Mr. Robot's a show that I gush about a lot, but I feel like this is the kind of episode that is going to put the show on a pedestal that I didn't even think it was capable of. I've really been contemplating for a while if Mr. Robot is, the greatest show on television right now, or if I think it's one of the greatest of all time, and this very much put it in that league. This absolutely solidified my absolute love for this show, how much I adore it, and how much I think it is going to stand the test of time. This is the kind of twist that I think we are going to be talking about years from now. I think this is the kind of twist that shows are going to want to top in that way. I think this is the kind of episode that shows are going to want to try to top. If shows are looking to do something really risky and different, this is exactly what they need to do. This is why I always harp on shows not wanting to do risky things like this, because it's so impressive when all the pieces come together in this way. And yes, it's rare for a show to pull it off, in as good as this one does, but when you have the right pieces and when you have the right story, it all just comes together in a nice, perfect bow like this episode did. This was absolutely the best episode of this entire show. And look, people have said that Mr. Robot turned out to be a highly straightforward show, and after this episode, that is definitely not the case at all. Moving forward, I don't know what's going to happen, because we still have a whole other half of a season left, truthfully, and that's what's great. We still have like 5 or 6 episodes left of this show. I would think that this is finally going to get Elliot to be his true self, but I also think this is going to distract him. I think knowing that, because remember, the Deus meeting is still happening. That's still very much something that is in the pipeline. It hasn't gone down yet, and we know that Elliot still has to be planning for that, but now I think he's going to be very distracted. He's going to be focusing on this. He's going to want answers from Darlene. If Darlene knew about this, if Darlene was honest with him, if Darlene, had an inkling about what was going on, if Darlene was abused in that way. I mean, there's so much left to get into here, and this really does change the whole show, but in such an excellent way. And not having Mr. Robot, that's something we've never seen from Elliot before, but I'm honestly looking forward to something where he has to work without Mr. Robot. Not worrying about Mr. Robot interfering, not working with Mr. Robot side by side, but now he has to do it on his own because he can't have Mr. Robot anymore. He has to do this on his own. He does have Krista. Krista, I think, is going to help him, and I think this episode definitely did reunite those two for sure, because we know for a while Krista was scared of Elliot, and I think the reasoning for this was because of Mr. Robot. I think she very much saw just how destructive he was in that way, but also the third personality. A lot of people are bringing this up. Where is this really headed? I think that the third personality, I think that very much is... to me personally, I think that the third personality either was something that, he was distracting, Elliot from. It could have very much been that. Or it's something that, again, he blocked out. And there actually is a third personality out there. I'm not entirely sure what that's about. We still know that Vera did come to Darlene's apartment and said something. We don't really know what that's all about. But maybe Elliot's never going to get that reveal. Maybe that's something that Elliot just isn't ever going to find out. And honestly, I don't really think it matters now. I think this is what matters moving forward. I think what matters now is Elliot dealing with this and how this is going to conflict with him trying to make sure that Deus Group goes in the best way possible for him and Darlene, and him trying to safely get Darlene out of there. I think this is going to be a distraction for him, but I also think it is going to turn things around for the better. Elliot's been heading in an anti-hero direction for a while. I think this is the thing that's going to humanize him. I think this is the thing that's going to bring him back to Earth, and I don't know if he's going to be able to fix things with Olivia. I don't know if he's going to be able to fix the things with those that he has unfairly wronged. Certainly, he's never going to get that, beautiful, happy ending that he wanted all the way back in Season 2. That's definitely never happening, but I do think that this is going to help Elliot for the better, because now he doesn't have to hide from this anymore. He can finally come to terms with it, and he has people that do care about him in that way, and I think moving forward that is going to help him. But again, it could go in the complete opposite direction. I honestly don't know, but either way, like I said, this is the kind of episode that I just consistently gush about. It's the kind of episode that I just can't talk about enough, and it's the kind of episode that I think really does put this show on the high pedestal that it really does deserve. So for all those reasons and more, I am absolutely going to give this episode of Mr. Robot, Season 4, Episode 7, Proxy Authentication Required, overall, a very deserving A+. Look, we all thought that the Silent episode a couple weeks ago was going to be the big, different type of episode of the show. And no, this was definitely it. This was the best this show's ever been. And I truthfully don't think they're going to top this. I don't think there is a way to top this episode. And I'm not looking for them to top it. I'm just looking for a really solid conclusion. Even if it does get a little messy from here on out, I'm just really glad that we were able to have this episode. I'm glad this episode worked as well as it did. I'm glad all the pieces fit together in that way, and I can't wait to see where things are going moving forward. But either way, guys, in my review of this episode, Mr. Robot, let me know if you guys saw this episode overall, left your thoughts. And I know I went on and on about how much I adored this episode, but like I said, episodes like this only come every so often. They only come up every so often, and when they come, I just have to gush about them because it's the kind of shit that I really do love. But this is the reason why I review certain shows like this individually, because I know eventually they were going to give me something big like this. I knew they were building to something big. I just didn't anticipate it would be this big of a change. I didn't expect it to be this drastic of a change. And like I said, moving forward, I have no idea how it's going to affect things, but we'll just have to see. But either way, guys, to my review of this episode of Mr. Robot, let me know if you guys saw this episode overall, left your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.